couple of things. Before I carry on, I want to say a couple of things. First is that given the speed at which I'm doing this, I'm going to skip some material, but two things. One is you'll have the slides. And if you want me to come back and explain the rest of it, I'm happy to do that. So don't worry in the next, sort of 45 minutes if I seem to just be skipping stuff. Don't worry about it. It'll still make sense. I just won't be giving as many examples. And the other thing is I want to say is does anyone have any questions right now? Any questions about anything I've said or not said? No? Sure? Okay. Then I'll talk about some things that get in the way. Now, the reason I've got very interested in this, these barriers, is because, as I say, it seems to me that people don't disagree with this. They don't disagree, but they don't do it. It's very difficult to do it. And I should add that I don't do it either. So one of my roles, of course, I'm basically a researcher and I guess an educator. And in both these roles, I'm not very evidence-based. So in terms of teaching at my university, everywhere I've worked in the UK, the main way of teaching is a bit like this. It's a lecture. Now, you all know something about how people learn. Do people learn from a lecture? No, they don't. So much. I apologize, but that's the way we do things. And it's just the same if I spoke to my students, and I've done this, and said, you know what, I don't think lectures are very effective. Why don't you tell me what you kind of want to learn? You tell me what you want to learn, and I will help structure your learning environment, and you can be really active and take control and steer things. And guess what happens? Most students say, no, I want a lecture. I want a lecture. I don't want, it's too much work. Just lecture. Okay. So what I'm saying is it's difficult to do it for everybody, including me. So don't think it, I'm not saying I'm great at evidence-based practice and everyone else is terrible. I'm just as bad. And it's partly because of some of these biases or some of these barriers I'm going to talk about now. So I won't talk about all of them. The first is misconceptions. So one thing I've found quite a lot, maybe we can learn from, yes, George, from the organizational change literature, but yeah, these are misconceptions of evidence-based practice I hear from IO psychologists and others that I think get in the way of evidence-based practice. The first is that people feel practitioners can't use their experience and expertise. That's not true, as I've just shown you. The other misconception is people think evidence tells you the truth and can prove things, but it can't. The truth is something, what is it? Is the truth a sunset? Is the truth a lovely little puppy? I don't know. What's the truth? The view of the sea? I don't know. Piece of music? I don't know. But it's not about data. And also proving things. You can't prove things with data or evidence or science. Proof is mathematical. Proof is algebra. Science doesn't prove anything. It gives you information. It gives you data. It's very provisional. There's always problems with it. It's not about proof. This is really important. Evidence isn't about that. Also, sometimes people feel that evidence-based practice is about making perfectly informed decisions. It's not. Instead, it's about making better informed decisions, like me choosing a restaurant. I don't want to go to the best restaurant in Paris. I just want to get a good dinner. It's not really the point. Also, sometimes people think gathering the evidence will give you the answer, and it won't, because we're not dealing with issues and problems, opportunities that have an answer. We're not dealing with that kind of stuff. We're not dealing with maths or a fact from history. We're not dealing with that. So we're not looking for answers here. And that's, again, quite hard to convince people of. And this gets in the way because when people try and do evidence-based practice, they get frustrated. They can't prove things. They find out everything's a bit more complicated than they thought. They go through this whole process and don't get a nice answer. And they think, well, what a waste of time. But that isn't the point of it. I think for us in IO psychology, we have some particular problems, I think, to do with misconceptions of science. Now, we often position ourselves, I think, compared to HR as the science people, right? We're the psychologists, where we've got the science, everybody. And I'm not sure we have. I'm not sure the way we think about science is useful. And I think a lot of these thoughts are misconceptions. The first thing is breakthrough studies or the latest ideas or techniques are the most important or useful. Absolutely not. But we're always looking for the next thing, the latest thing, the new thing. This is not what science is about. Single scientific studies can be important. No, I would say single scientific studies are never important. Why? Because it's just one study. It doesn't matter. Show me 10, show me 20, show me 30. Yeah, I'm going to get interested. Single study doesn't matter. And I'll go so far as to say when we teach IO psychology, unless it's to teach people methodology, we shouldn't even read single studies. They're just not important. Just not important because it's a body of evidence that's important. It's a bit like the equivalent of saying, I'm going to look at organizational data and evidence-based practice. And all you do is you look at one spreadsheet with one piece of information. Sorry, you're not looking at organizational data. You're picking one thing out. It doesn't matter. You have to look at all of it, get a sense of what's going on. The third misconception is that science published in peer-reviewed journals can automatically be trusted. Of course it can't. I'm sure some of you are aware of a lot of the problems that have been happening in publishing in the last 20 or 30 years. Science is the highest quality evidence compared to all other sources. No, not necessarily. It depends on the question. It depends on the problem. No, science isn't the highest source. Scientists themselves are reliable sources of evidence. No, they're not. They're just as biased as anybody else. They themselves, particularly if they conducted the study, are not reliable sources of evidence themselves. Their work might be, sure, but they themselves are not. Data you collect and studies done in organization are not science, so that's not true. Of course it can be scientific. Also, these expressions, science shows, studies find, we know from science. No, no, no. Nonsense. Whenever you see or hear terms like this, you should be very, very suspicious because they're just meaningless. It doesn't tell you anything. Also, I think in psychology in particular, neuro, whatever is the best science because it's about the brain, right? It's about the brain. Wow, the brain. And of course, it doesn't mean that at all because a lot of the psychological knowledge we have doesn't require any understanding of the brain because it's about behavior, it's about external things, about other stuff. Doesn't mean that at all. And also a lot of neuroscience itself, as you know, is often quite poor quality. But if you're interested in this, there's two Twitter accounts called Neurobollocks and Neuroskeptic, who basically try to look at some of the claims being made about neuroscience, sometimes from organizational psychologists, sometimes from managers, sometimes from gurus, sometimes from HR people, and try and question, like neuro leadership or neuro marketing or neuro whatever. I think for us in organizational psychology, I think another misconception is that sort of there's a vague idea that if we used vaguely approved tools, it's the same as doing evidence-based practice. So we feel sometimes that somebody somewhere has done the research and they've given it a stamp. Here's your evidence-based practice stamp. By the way, there's no such thing as an evidence-based practice, in case you're wondering. Depends. Depends on the problem, the context, so it's silly. You can't say this is an evidence-based practice. It doesn't mean anything. Because you don't have any information on the other sources, you don't know what the problem is. Anyway, but things like assessment centers, engagement surveys, leadership development, 360-degree feedback, some forms of training, coaching, it's not. So just because you think there is a technique that there is some evidence that might support, you can't just grab that technique and do it and you're being evidence-based. You're not, because what's the problem you're trying to fix? Will this intervention fix it better than other techniques? What are the costs and benefits here? How much valid evidence shows that this technique is in general effective? How much evidence shows it will work in this context? And even using a technique which evidence shows might work is not the same as evidence-based practice. And I feel that sometimes happens with IO psychologists. They talk about a particular kind of assessment. They'll talk about the fact there's lots of meta-analyses, and then bang, here you go, evidence-based. It's not what it means. It's not what evidence-based practice means. And that's sort of quite dangerous. I think also, again, this applies to us a bit, but particularly to HR. I think there's an assumption that somehow using organizational data, the idea of data analytics, is the same as evidence-based practice. In other words, all you need is really good organizational data or data from employees, and that's all you need to do it. It's not. So imagine going to see your doctor and she says to you, they're going to diagnose you and treat you by only looking at maybe blood tests, MRI scans, CAT scans, other diagnostics. And she, your doctor, is going to completely ignore any evidence from medical science. She's going to completely ignore her professional expertise as a doctor. And she's going to completely ignore what you think as the patient. You will probably think that wasn't a great doctor. Nonetheless, that's exactly what some people who are really interested in data analytics do. They ignore every other source because they think they've got the best stuff. It's a bit like this. You're knocking out 3 other very important sources of evidence. But that's a real trend at the moment. I think data analytics is all you need. Well, it isn't all you need. It's useful, but it's just one source. So this is a bit I'm going to skip. And this is about something called strong and wrong beliefs. So again, I won't go into this now, but it's quite interesting. If you present people with certain questions, such as things like job satisfaction in the past 15 years, this is pre-pandemic, by the way, pre-pandemic, but I think it's actually gone up. George is saying, yes, in God we trust, all others must bring data, indeed. If you look at a question like job satisfaction and you ask this question, do you think it's generally gone up, gone down, stayed the same? It is astounding how many people say, oh, it's gone down. Job satisfaction's gone down. Stress gone up. Yeah, stress has gone up. And of course, if you look at the data, it doesn't really seem to be the case at all. So this is I'll just give you one slight example. This is job satisfaction up to 2016 in the UK. And basically it's a yellow line, which is important, but it really hasn't changed very much. And this is from the United States, going from 1989 to 2016. But again, if you look at the, it's barely shifted. If you add them together, probably the best thing to do, most reliable thing to do, it's hardly changed. But again, people assume that. So you and I and everybody has a whole set of beliefs about what's going on in the workplace, around behavior and society that often aren't true. And they can strongly shape what we do in organizations, like the idea of generational differences, Gen X, Gen Y, those kinds of things we're going to talk about now. The third barrier, and this applies to all practitioners, and to us as people, is cognitive biases. And this is a very important barrier to evidence-based practice. So the idea is, I'm sure you've all heard of this, and it's a bit simplistic as far as I understand it, is you have this idea of system 1 and system 2 thinking. So system 1 is this really fast, emotional, easy, low effort, use of heuristics, cognitive shortcuts to sort of just, oh, that's cool, that's wow, get that, yeah, quick, easy sort of decisions. System 2 is slow. It requires more critical reason. It's much more effortful. The idea is, in inverted commas, big inverted commas, we're hardwired to make these fast decisions because the idea is they're good evolutionary terms, but also because most decisions is fine. Most decisions we make automatically and they work really well. However, it is not good for larger, more complicated, more important decisions. And one way you can see, in a sense, some of this system stuff working is in visual illusion. Now, again, you've all got psychological backgrounds. I'm sure you're aware of this. And you might want to turn your screen up and watch it full screen if you want to see some of these illusions. It's very exciting. It's like being a magician show, isn't it? Something, circus, perhaps. Okay, so here's some. Now you're aware of this. Now, as you know, this looks like the lines are wonky, right? But they're not wonky. They're absolutely parallel. But it's pretty convincing, right? It looks pretty wonky. But you know and I know, because we've probably seen it before, it's an illusion. But nonetheless, it looks like that. The question is, how can you test it? Your eyes are telling you the lines are not straight. You can do a couple of things. One is you can look down the edge of the screen. If you actually look down the edge of your screen, you'll see the lines are parallel. Or you can just get a ruler and measure out. You'll see they're parallel. It's a really classic example based on, I guess, the Muller liar and other kinds of things. This is another classic, because all these elephants are the same size. The one at the front looks bigger. I just ask you to look at that. It's pretty hard to not believe the one at the front isn't the biggest, isn't it? It's pretty difficult. It looks the biggest. And if you didn't know this was a lecture about, or a bit of a lecture about cognitive biases, you go, yeah, of course, no. And you didn't know about illusions. Of course you would. It looks absolutely clear. Now, what's this? Oh, Caroline's measuring it. Good for you. Is this an illusion? This is a classic employee engagement model. Is it an illusion? It looks like it's telling me that there's driver's engagement and then there's these outcomes. Oh, wow, that's great. But is it? Is it an illusion? How can I check it? Well, you can't look down the side. You can measure it. You can say, is it the case that work experience leads to, say, people stay in the organization and it increases customer satisfaction? Is there something behind that? Is this some make it up, or is this just an illusion? Most of this is probably an illusion. Here's some other examples. This is just weird because these circles should appear to move a little bit. This is one of the most extreme I've got of the parallel lines. So the blue horizontal lines are parallel, but it's kind of impossible to believe. Just impossible to believe, but they are. Oh, what's this? It's another illusion. Who knows what this is? Does anybody know what this is? I'll give you a clue. It's a model of change.
Yes, the Kotter model of change.
That's right. It's Kotter's model of change, taught throughout the world.
The vision. Create the vision.
Possibly on your program as well, all the time. HR, everybody. Is it an illusion? Is it real? It looks nice. It looks like you create urgency. You do this. You do this. You do. And that, my friends, is how you do change. Is it? I don't know. What is it? I would say it's an illusion. A bit like this. It looks like something, but maybe it's not what it seems. Now, how many dots can you see at any one time? How many dots can you see? Look around the screen. Deborah's adjusting her eyes. You can see, oh, you mean, okay, at one time? Yeah, but not at the same time. Yes, no, exactly. There it says 4, then it says 3, yeah. So when you look around, it appears that the dots move to where you look. Now, obviously, that's not happening. Deborah says not at the same time. But again, if you didn't know what was going on and someone hadn't told you it was a visual illusion, you go, yeah, actually, they're kind of popping up in different places. But weirdly, they keep popping up where I happen to be looking. This is another good example. So these look like these circles are kind of going into each other like this, they're overlapping like that. But again, they're not. How can you test it? Well, just follow one around with your eyes. Just follow one around with your finger. You'll see they're all separate circles. They look like they're going into each other. Yeah, it seems like a spiral, exactly. Yeah. This is just a weird one. There's people, as you know, psychologists specialize in producing these kind of illusions. That's just a weird one. That's just a weird one. I'm going to all of these. They're just things, yeah. This one, if you look at it, it might not work for you. Depends on your screen and the kind of things. But it might look as though they're moving slightly, kind of slightly oscillating, so slightly, and if it's working for you. Right, what did it say? What did it say in that triangle? Some of you have probably seen this before. What did it say?
Paris in the spring.
Paris in the spring. Okay, Deborah says Paris in the spring too. Yeah. So typically, have you seen it before, Deborah? No? That's very good reading, yeah. So usually when people see this, they read it as Paris in the spring. Sorry, as you did, but it's not Paris in the spring, is it?
The spring.
Paris in the spring, exactly. There's loads of things like that. And this is a great example of system one. As you know, the reason we can read so quickly is because we've learned over many years to read, and we read without thinking. We read unconsciously. And because we do that, it's the same thing that one lets us read really fast. It's exactly the same thing that means we miss out the second the. Now, often it doesn't matter at all, but it might. But it's a really good example, I think, of that kind of thing. Here's another one. I don't know if you can read this, or you've seen it before. Now, you probably think you can't read it, but just try. I know it's difficult. English is not your, I guess, your first language. So I'm guessing some of you can read it. It says, this message serves to prove how our minds can do amazing things, impressive things. In the beginning, it was hard, but your mind is reading it automatically, etc., etc., etc. Then it says, be proud. Only certain people can read this. I don't think that's true, but anyway, yeah. Okay, Muriel says you have something like that in Portuguese, exactly. And this, again, is a great example of your system one. Your system one allows you to ignore all the nonsense and actually read it. Brilliant. Now, I've got another challenge for you. I want you to try and not read something, if that makes sense. I'm going to put something on the screen. Try to not read it without closing your eyes. Try to just not read it. Did anybody manage it? No. You can't not read. It's so automatic. You can't help it. And again, this is the power of our system one. So imagine taking that power into a work meeting, to a context, to making a decision, to being an organizational psychologist, that power of the speed of just seeing things or missing things, because often we're making decisions so quick and so automatically and so not consciously that's one of the reasons. I won't talk about that now. So the question is, what do we do about this, or how do we illustrate the principles? First, I think it tells you should never, ever just believe what we see or hear. You shouldn't just believe it. Images, words, numbers, graphs can deceive our senses because of all kinds of cognitive biases. We always need to look at multiple sources of data to check out our initial perception, to triangulate. In the case of visual illusions, to look at it literally from another angle or measure it using a ruler. In the case of cognitive illusions, which I'm going to show you one now, slow down or think about it in another way. In other words, we're surrounded by stuff. A lot of it might be pretty unreliable, but we don't know because we're processing it so fast. So I want you to answer this question. I'll give you about 10 seconds to do it. I would like, if it's okay, type your answer in the chat box. You can change this to dollars and cents if it helps. Three, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, so I'd like you to type your answer, if that's okay, into the chat box. Deborah says 5. Anyone else? Is everyone checking out Deborah's answer? Now, did you copy, George, or did you work it out? No, very good. Yeah, so interestingly, Deborah's got the right answer, but what do most people say? What do you think most people say? Yeah, exactly. The answer, something like 85% of people give, including me, is 10. Because you see, bat and ball, £1.10. The bat costs £1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? And what wants to pop out is 10. You're kind of answering a different question rather than the one asked. So this is quite interesting. Sometimes I use this with sort of managers and senior managers, and some of them are absolutely horrified that they get it wrong. I can say, don't worry about it. You know, you think, don't worry about this, worry about all the other things you get wrong. You know, because this is just an example. It's just like an extreme example, but it happens all the time, I think. Yeah. There's another couple here you can maybe look at if you want to on the slides, and I'll share the slides later. Yeah, and there's lots of other biases, framing effect, metacognitive bias. These are things that get in the way, the barriers to evidence-based practice, hindsight bias, etc., etc. Confirmation bias, one of the most important. We look for information and interpret information that's consistent with what we want to believe. Of course we do. And this is a cognitive bias codex that's on Wikipedia, just showing all the kinds of biases we have. So one of the things to remember is that we, as people, as psychologists, we're both very, very smart, and we're also very easily fooled and stupid, for want of a better word. We're both. They're not contradictions, we're both. And in a way, evidence-based practice has evolved in part to help prevent us being fooled. It's evolved to stop some of this. It doesn't completely stop it, but it helps a bit. So what can we do about biases? Well, recognize they're produced because we're brilliant information processing. What makes us brilliant for some things is terrible for other things. As I say, evidence-based practice was developed to help us deal to some extent with cognitive bias. A critical evaluation of the quality. Don't just believe what you read, see, or hear, even if it's some great authority or some great paper or published in a great journal or whatever it is, and also use multiple sources, because that should help you with them to some extent. That's another bias. Okay. So I'm going to very, very quickly talk about fads, because I want to get into organizational psychology. So management fads, I'm sure you're all aware of them, that they are interventions that are subject to social contagion. People think they're new, they're exciting, and they're best than what we're doing. They're perceived to be quite innovative, and often they're actually not. They're aimed at improving performance, either through materially doing it or through enhancement. People adopt fads and fashions because they can make them look good. They're motivated by desire to fix a problem or capitalize on opportunities. And they're often considered to be of transitory value because usually not much evidence emerges supporting their use, although they're adopted quite widely. So this is re-engineering, for example, which is popular probably in the sort of 70s and 80s. Excellent, again, very much an 80s thing. TQM, still around to some extent. Talent, war for talent, machine lean production. And this is an attempt by Richard Pascale to try and look at the way in which these fads have come in and out of fashion. So they're very distracting. Those of you, and I understand from George, a lot of you have organizational experience, you will know if you go to talk to people in HR, an HR department, often what they want to do are exactly all these things, the latest thing, the new thing, the most exciting thing. And as a psychologist, we sometimes have difficulty saying, why do you want to do that? What's the problem? What's the issue? And they go, I don't care, I want to do. Yeah, they want the 4.0 thing, exactly. Yeah. And it's a very strong driver of decision making. What should we do? We don't really know what the problem is, but we need to do something probably. Let's do that thing because it's cool, it's new, everyone else is doing whatever it is. And of course, often they turn out to not make sense. So this In Search of Excellence book tried to look at what these best run companies, most successful companies were doing, and looked at what they had in common. And it appeared to be the case that some years later, 10, 15, 20 years later, most of these companies were not very successful at all. And the war for talent is the idea that all you need to do is employ the best people. It turned out again, partly because it was developed in Enron as a model, but also it's just the idea that the best people produce the best things is also very questionable in an organizational context. So they get in the way of evidence-based practice because they get in the way of clear and critical thinking. They encourage something called solutioneering. So a very important concept that you may have or you will come across is solutioneering, whereby people identify a problem by the absence of a solution. So the problem is our managers have low emotional intelligence. Now that's not a problem. What's the problem? Well, our engagement scores are too low. That's not a problem. What's the problem we're trying to deal with? Or the problem is we don't have a coaching program. Or the problem is we don't have enough, whatever it is. So rather than actually understand the problem and try and fix it, you identify a problem by the solution you've already thought of, and then you solve it. But you don't know what the problem is, and the solution, therefore, is not going to work. So fads may be effective, but they're not the panaceas they often claim to be. Even if they work, their effect may not be large. They may be no more effective than existing interventions. They can be harmful. And one of the key things is they're often over-applied. So even if like lean manufacturing, even if that might work, it probably works in some ways in very particular contexts, not for every single process in every single kind of organization. So they can be kind of harmful too. So how can you spot a management fad? This is a classic paper. They're buzzy and exciting. Why? Because they appeal to a system and think, oh, that's cool, that's good. They make massive claims with no good quality supporting evidence. They involve management gurus or academic superstars. It's all good. There's no downside. This thing is just wonderful. It's a universal panacea, work everywhere for everything. They use lots of unverifiable anecdotes and success stories. You see these in TED Talks. You see these even from scientists and researchers who often actually persuade people using an anecdote, but often from big, well-known companies whose success is attributed to the fact of no good evidence, and they often involve new words which don't actually describe anything new. So metrics for measures, or analytics for analysis, or big data just to mean data, or talent to mean people, or whatever. So these are clues that tell you something is a kind of fad. Now, you may be wondering, are there things in organizational psychology, psychology that might be fad? Yeah, the grit, yeah, exactly, Ahoy. Grit is a great example, yeah, exactly. And I would say, from my understanding, well, things like mindset is not a good thing, where actually the claims seem to be a bit, so I think psychological safety, it's not, there's nothing there, but it seems to overlap a lot with other things. It's not clear what it's really showing or not, but the claims that are made for it are quite strong. So we have mindfulness, engagement, positive psychology, strengths, emotional intelligence, etc. So Deborah's made a comment, thank you. She says, this is so difficult to prevent. Yeah, because the C-level often reads a bestseller exactly, or Harvard Business Review, or something like that, and brings down all sorts of new fashionable trends. Absolutely. And it comes back to this point in a way as well, that everyone's an expert in human behavior. So the C-level would read a book, and it's often like, I don't know, by Daniel Pink or something, or it's some sort of, about human behavior at work. And they will say, yeah, I get that, I understand it, let's do that thing. If it was about something really technical, firstly, you wouldn't be able to sell a best-selling guru book about it. But also I think the C-level person would assume they don't know anything about it. So it's really tricky, I think. And I actually know, again, it's anecdotal, but I know a number of quite good anecdotes, Deborah, where organizational psychologists and HR people have literally told me this story many times. And I supervised a master's dissertation some years ago where somebody in the organization was recommended on a plane, a book to read. It's called Re-Engineering the Corporation or something, Re-Engineering book. And he bought this book, he read it on the plane, he came back, as soon as he got back, he bought everyone in the company a copy and just said, we are doing this. Yeah, so I think you're right. It is very difficult. And we as psychologists can seem to be the people that are spoiling everybody's fun. We're raining on the parade. We're being a spoil sport. We're not letting people play with these fun ideas. And I think that's a real challenge, because sometimes it means, I think we adopt some of those to try and compete in the same sort of market, the same space. So why do people go with fads? Well, it's cool and fun and neat. It's the system on thinking, which is fine if you're doing some things, buying stuff, buying kitchen equipment, whatever, but not if you're making an important decision. It's defensive and you can't get into trouble. If you're doing what everyone else is doing, you can't, yeah. People believe the latest thing is probably the best thing, as indeed researchers and scientists do as well. If other people are doing it, then surely it works. You can't imagine like, oh, Google is doing this thing. Google wouldn't be doing this thing if it didn't work. Well, it's a very huge assumption, but also it's easier, less thinking is kind of required. I think that's why people go with it. And this piece of kitchen equipment analogy is based on the idea that if you look around your house at things you've bought, you'll probably find a lot of stuff that you don't really ever use and you wonder why you bought it. And I think it's because that's a good example of something that is fashionable or kind of a fad for a while. And these are some of the things you might see in your kitchen cupboard that you never really use, like a juicer or a bread maker or a steamer or a fondue set or a pasta, whatever. And it's a good example because lots of people buy them. A good example, I think, is the juicer. This is the juicer at the top left. I think, I don't know, of all the juicers sold in the world in the last 20 years, I reckon about 5% have been used more than a couple of times. And I saw this, it's just like what people buy it thinking it's going to be great, but they don't know that they really have a juice deficiency and that it will be fixed by buying a juicer. But nonetheless, we're surrounded in our personal lives by stuff we've got into and bought because we thought it seemed cool and a good idea. We didn't think about it too much. And that's kind of what management fads do as well. excuse me. So I won't talk about consultants as much, but some consultancies can certainly help drive fads and get in the way of evidence-based practice. Because for some consultancies, their model, their business model, is to get work, to get more work, and keep getting work. That's it. That's the business model. As long as people are paying them for stuff, that's fine. Preferably more and more stuff. So what a consultancy might do is persuade a client they need some new things. Let's say something mindfulness or a mindfulness app or something. So they sell this relevant product or service or intervention, and then the market is saturated. Everybody's got it. Everybody's going to buy your mindfulness app, has already bought it. Then you need to invent or borrow a new idea, technique, or approach, and then sell it to them instead, and repeat and repeat and repeat. So the business model of some, if not many consultants, is to literally do this: create a need, develop a product, sell it, saturate the market, do it again and again and again and again. Now, what that means is that kind of approach is clearly completely anti-evidence-based practice. It's more about doing stuff. Yeah. Power and policies. I'm not going to talk about this now, but this is why managers, including the C-suite, are they rewarded for being evidence-based or not? I would argue that generally they're rewarded not for being evidence-based. And these are two quotes that kind of summarizes it in a way. One is more personal. Reasoning will never make someone correct an ill opinion, which by reasoning they never acquired. In other words, managers and others may have all kinds of views and opinions that they didn't arrive at by reason and evidence. So you can't persuade someone to change their mind if they didn't arrive at that position using reason. It's very difficult to do that because that's not what it's based on. And also, this quote based on Upton Sinclair, it is difficult to get someone to understand something when their salary depends on them not understanding. And often in organizations, in HR and other kinds of contexts, people, for example, don't want to understand that the thing they're doing is very ineffective. They don't want to understand that because they're being paid to do that. They don't want to understand that. So they will find another way of finding how it is effective or making an excuse or whatever it kind of is. So yeah, so the incentives for managers are not there either. Okay, so now I want to turn to evidence-based organizational psychology, to this program, to this course, to what we do. It's the same as medicine, management, or evidence-based anything. It's no different. It's exactly the same in terms of the principles. They're exactly the same. I think there's an immediate problem for us. Most organizational psychologists, certainly as it sounds like in your context and my context, they're freelance or they work in small consultancies. So in my career, I must have taught possibly getting on for thousands of master's students in organizational psychology. I would say nearly all of them work for themselves. They work in small consultancies. Their clients are usually HR managers, not always, but usually, who for the most part have already decided what they want. They've already decided. For example, we want an assessment center. Can you run an assessment center? I can, but what's the problem? I don't care. Can he run an assessment center? We need an assessment center. They've already decided what they want. So we are brought in, I think, often as technical experts. So they're the people that know how to do training. They're the people who can design an assessment. They're the people who can run an assessment center. If you say, but what's the problem? What's the opportunity? Doesn't matter. They've already decided they want that. So you were really stuck because the way our profession, I guess, has evolved. And they were stuck, I guess, pleasing our clients who've often decided what they want. If we want the work, we have to do what clients want. And people have told me, practitioners have told me, they can only push back so much. Because if you say to the client, I'm not just going to run an assessment center, I want to understand what the selection issue, problem, opportunity is here. If they push back too much, the client will say, but there's 100 other psychologists who can do this. So bye-bye. So it's tricky, it's tricky. In other words, do organizational psychologists get much opportunity to practice in an evidence-based way? And I would argue that's one of the particular constraints? Yeah, for us, I suppose. So here's some criteria developed with Denise Rousseau for thinking about, in general, how you evaluate evidence-based practice professions. So it could be policing, social work, physiotherapy, a teacher, it doesn't matter, but what would you look for in that profession? Well, these are 6 criteria. Firstly, the term evidence-based is well known and used. Yeah, you would expect to see that because, you know, it's possible to practice in an evidence-based way without understanding the term, but it seems unlikely to me. Primary published research is available to practitioners and systematic reviews, not so much. I don't know about you in your context, but certainly in my context, once you've finished training, it's actually quite hard to access primary research unless you're prepared to pay for it. So it's quite hard to access it. It's getting a bit easier, but also there aren't many systematic research summaries in our field yet. The third thing you expect to see is that cutting edge practices, panaceas, and new ideas are treated with healthy skepticism. A little bit, but I think also organizational psychologists partly develop those new exciting panaceas and practices. There's demand from evidence-based practice from clients and customers. I mentioned maybe not so much. Practice decisions draw on the 4 sources of information. I don't know, I don't see that. I see the use of evidence, but I don't see drawing on 4 sources. And also we would expect to see that initial training and development adopt an evidence-based practice approach. And again, I would say not so much. I'm going to give you some examples of each of these. How much is the term evidence-based used in organizational psychology? So this is a Google search, very unreliable. I typed in exact quotes, evidence-based medicine, evidence-based policy, evidence-based policing, and so forth. So let's look, the most important ones to look at, I guess, well, management is pretty interesting. There's more, if you look for evidence-based management, it comes up with evidence-based management of diabetes. You have to, if you take away those, you actually get probably a more realistic estimate. Look at clinical psychology, 164,000. Health psychology, 149,000. Educational, 31. Go down to organizational psychology, it's 7,000. And if you take my name out, the search reduces it to that. Not because I'm so great, just because I'm the only one going on about it. I'm the only person, I'm one of the few people talking about it. So take me out of the picture and it drops quite a lot. Evidence-based IO psychology, again, barely any hits. Occupational psychology, which is a British term for organizational psychology, again, hardly anything. Work and organizational psychology, which is a more European term, 8 hits. Work psychology, 2 hits. So compare our psychology to other areas of psychology, and you can see, yeah, the term is not well known in our field. So again, congratulations that you're doing this program. You know, it's not well known. Primary published research, yet not really. There aren't many systematic reviews. I mentioned when you finish your training, it's hard to get access. They have to pay for articles. And that's why some people set up something called Science for Work. It's actually some IO psychology master students. If you come across Science for Work, it's worth checking out. What they try to do is make reviews or systematic summaries of evidence available to practitioners. It's really worth looking at their site. They haven't been so active recently. So fads and fashions, I discussed that. Yes, I think OP to some extent. Is there a demand? Maybe a little bit, but I think not so much. And again, it's very hard to be an evidence-based practitioner if your clients don't want that. Yeah, CPD is not so much, certainly in my concept, evidence-based. So I want to just jump ahead a little bit to about using evidence. So I think if you want to be an evidence-based practitioner in any field, I think it's a long-term career, professional commitment as an individual or a business or a team or a partnership to collecting and using different forms of evidence. You almost, to me, have to decide, this is how I want to practice as a psychologist. This is how I want to be. It may not always be possible, but this is how I think I should practice as a psychologist. I think we need to develop habits and routines and the skills to do it. I think we need to build evidence into project planning when we're planning something with the client, to build it in at every sort of stage. And also be prepared to give up cherished beliefs, things you love, you may have to just give up. And also be prepared to not get work. Yeah, like Cochrane plain summaries, exactly. Yeah, similar kind of thing. Yeah. Also working with clients, be prepared to walk away. Also show the benefits of evidence-based approach. What is the alternative? Something I say, I don't think it works, but something I say to try and sell it is I always say, do you want to do what's the most important thing? Do you want to do what's more likely to work? And that's all we're trying to do here. And again, some clients are a bit scared about that because they don't really want to do that, but they don't really want to say no. So they end up doing something else, which is fine, but some clients then get it. I think ought to steer clients away from a specific technique. So I know I want to do unconscious bias training. Fine, unconscious bias training, but what's the problem? What's the issue here? What's the opportunity? Let's look at that first. And it may be unconscious bias training is going to be quite useful. But can we just forget the specific? Can we just forget assessment centers for a minute? Can we think about what the issue is? And I think steering clients away is useful. And also think demonstrate why this is being part of being a psychologist. Why a psychologist is different? Because again, my sense is HR practitioners often cannot see the difference between a psychologist and someone who offers training, or someone can do testing, or someone that can, whatever, do coaching. They don't see the difference. And to me, that's a problem. We should be different as psychologists because that's all our training is about. It's about using evidence, using science, collecting data, diagnosing, thinking about the problem, thinking about the solutions, not looking for easy answers. That's what psychologists do. And it's not what these other practitioners do because HR people can't see the difference sometimes. It's very hard to do on your own. You can share and review evidence with partners. You can set up groups to review evidence in particular fields. That is happening a bit. You can work with academics, but it's not necessarily a good idea for reasons I'll go on to now. It's a very good idea. Okay, so I'm just going to talk about what should I do? Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about researchers. So we talked a lot about trustworthiness of evidence or not, and it's worth bearing in mind that certainly in the last 10, 20 years, there have been a lot of criticisms about the way in which scientists conduct themselves and their research, which doesn't mean we don't use scientific evidence, but it means we should be very careful about it. So this was a study done a while ago about management researchers looking at, they said to people, have you ever heard of anybody doing these things? And this is roughly, what people said. So people withholding results, selecting any data that supported it, using other people's ideas, all the kind of things that you shouldn't really do as a researcher. Keaton and Daniel did a review specifically of IO psychologists, published from 2013. Lots of things like fabricating data, publication bias. I'm sure you're all aware of that. People do a study, they don't support the hypotheses, they either ignore it or they change the hypotheses. Hypotheses in IO psychology journals are almost always increasing and always supported. That means academics are approaching omniscience. We don't need to do these studies anymore. We just have an idea and it'll be true. No hypothesis significance testing, and I won't go into all of these here. Marina says, p-hacking, as George says, Marina says, 10 years after your articles, Rousseau, where are we? Do we advance? I would say no. I see no clear signs of advancement at all. I think there's a few indications, like this course, sure. So I am invited quite a lot to talk on programs, great. A little tiny bit, but I don't think professional bodies are really into it. And I don't see IO psychologists on the ground who are particularly into this. So no, I think it hasn't changed much. This comes back to the things we talk about. It's the incentives. It is what people are paid for. It is the barriers. It's very difficult to do it. Very difficult to do it. As you can see, it also is for academics, by the way.
Can I just say that, for example, IAWOP, our European organization they don't clearly state that we should use. They don't create a task force as American Psychological did in almost 20 years ago. So it's clear that it's not a concern, I would say. A big concern, at least in Europe.
And neither does PSYOP. So I would say it's a concern. Okay, this is my take. My take is that professional bodies are worried that if they get into evidence-based practice, it will become clear that maybe quite a lot of the stuff that we do is not very good. And they are there to, I guess, what they would say is protect the profession and protect the reputation of the profession. And so I think there's some concern that if they really get into this, it will be damaging to the profession. I would argue, well, if it is damaging, that's good, because we shouldn't be doing things that are ineffective. So, but they would say, yeah, but we're trying to support and help this profession. Yeah, it's weird. It's very odd. It's very, very odd. Yeah. And I've had these discussions with EWOP. I've had these discussions with PSYOP like 15 years ago. And people are uneasy and they don't trust it a bit. Because I think for me, one of the things about being evidence-based practice is you have to accept that some of what you've done is actually not very good, unless you think you're just wonderful. Some of the stuff you've done historically is probably not, and now it's probably not going to be very good. And if you don't accept that, you won't be interested in evidence-based practice. Yeah. And again, I think it's academics who often are important in these professional bodies like EWOP, more than practitioners. I think academics don't like this either. They feel uneasy about it. I've had a lot of interesting conversations with quite senior biopsychologists who are kind of a bit, they feel worried about it. Yeah.
If I may, just to
please.
To add, well, if for example, I know that Cochrane is medical and towards medical approaches.
Sure.
But they have the work group in which I collaborate. And if you look the quantity, the amount of systematic reviews and protocols produced by the work group, and if you check the other groups that Cochrane has, the difference is astonishing, is gigantic, because people from the occupational subjects, work and organizational subjects are not used to think in this systematic way and to try to check how good is our evidence, which is the quality of our evidence. They don't want to be confronted with failure or with lack of evidence.
And they don't. And we want, and I think also we want to, it happens in any profession, we want to have our heroes, our heroines. And these are typically people that publish a huge amount. And they discover apparently new things that turn out to maybe not so new after all. But some of us like that. We like the idea that these are great scientific figures. And even that in any field is very dangerous, very dangerous. So for example, people are now really questioning journals like Nature, so-called elite or luxury journals, as some people call them, because they argue they're distorting the whole scientific process. Even the Nobel Prizes for science are distorting scientific process, it is argued, because science shouldn't be about superstars. It should be about trying to systematically answer questions in an open and honest way. But that, doesn't seem to happen as much as it should. Absolutely, yeah. Danton Archite summarized this quite well, talking about these diseases that stifle the production of useful research. Talks about significosis, an inordinate focus on statistical significance results, neophilia, an excessive appreciation for novelty, theoria, a mania for new theory, aragorium, a deficiency of rigor in theoretical and empirical work, disjunctivitis, a proclivity to produce large quantities of redundant, trivial, and incoherent words. I think that describes biopsychology and other fields actually quite well. It's quite a good kind of shorthand. And they also, as he says, cast doubt on the role of science in society. And just a couple of examples. I guess many of you heard of the impact factor for journals, how important it is. Things like the promotion of academics, the promotion of scientists. This was a study asking people if editors had ever tried to make authors include in their references articles from that journal. Because one of the ways the main way you increase your impact factor is to get more citations for articles in your journal. So in this study, 19% of authors experienced coercion. They said, yes, the editor at the final stage of accepting the paper said, would you include this? 86% agreed it's inappropriate, though 57% would still add them to get the paper published. So in other words, this kind of bad scientific behavior is not odd, it's completely normal. It's not an unusual thing, it's completely sort of standard. Don't talk about that. This is about the fact how little most scientific research is used, even by other researchers. You know, most scientific research is in this big warehouse that no one ever looks at, most of it. Okay, on to that. This is quite interesting. This is conducted by Finelli. I don't know what's happened since 2012, but this is the percentage of positive results across all disciplines from 1991 to 2007. It's gone up from what, 70% to 85%. So if you look at any journal, you look at hypotheses, you look at how many turn out to be supported, it's just amazing. Now, something very odd is going on, which again, going back to my point, this is why you can't automatically trust science. In this sense, you can't automatically trust everything. This is a nice piece by Ernest O'Boyle. Management research is fishy, says new management research. And what they did is they got academic articles that were based on North American PhDs. So they could get the PhD thesis and they could look at the papers, the journal articles that came from it. They could compare. Guess what happened? For the PhD dissertation, 82 hypotheses were supported, that for every 100 were unsupported, so about equal. By the time the papers went to journals, the ratio went to 200 to 100 supported. And 90% of the papers dropped added hypotheses. 70% of the added hypotheses were statistically significant compared to those that were dropped, and 20% of the studies dropped subjects. This is kind of normal science. I'm only saying it to get over the point that sometimes people think scientists themselves, because they gather evidence, they are evidence-based in their practice, but they're not. They do all kinds of stuff which really is not evidence-based. Okay, I've just noticed the time. I'm going to try. I won't talk about null hypothesis significance testing now. Yeah, but just generally the point, I think academics don't particularly like evidence-based practice either. They don't. I'll give you the simplest example I can give is replication. So if you explain to a child about science and what science is, apart from like having a transparent process and showing the findings, reporting the findings, whatever they are, which even a child understand, you would also talk about replications. So if you get a finding in one study, that's not enough. You do it again and again and again, different contexts, different teams, to see if the result holds up or not. You know, I think kids kind of get that, but in our field, it's changing a little bit, but if you wanted to publish a direct replication, the journal editors would say, there's no novelty in this. There's nothing new in this. We're not going to publish it. It's nothing new. That in itself is anti-science, if you think about it. But that is being done by the gatekeepers, the people responsible for what gets in our journals or doesn't get it. Even just that small example, I think is quite important. So academics don't like it. I think practitioners don't always like it because they need to get work fast. As I said, they're not rewarded for doing what works. Often IO psychology are rewarded for doing stuff, not for stuff that necessarily works. Sometimes there's not confidence about academic and skills, but I don't know if that's necessarily true. Some feel they can't use their judgment, but also I think people get to enjoy and be skilled at, comfortable with certain techniques. So I'll give you an example, which is MBTI and other kinds of those typing personality tools. Even though psychologists kind of know on one level they're not great measures of personality, they get really good at using them and their clients love them and they do team building work and they get asked back and they do it again and they build up a nice little sideline in doing MBTI, which they're often a little bit embarrassed about if you ask them, but because they like doing it and they're very good at it. But is it working? I don't know. But it's these the incentives, I suppose, other things. Yeah, this is just an example of occupational psychologists. These are the number of people in the UK who are chartered. It means they belong to the professional body. And this is what they mentioned. They mentioned Belbin team roles, 634 LinkedIn accounts, mentioned that. Master Neuro-Linguistic Practitioner, 2,000, MBTI 18,000, and NLP 84,000. Yeah, kind of interesting that so many people did it. So just to conclude, I think it's a choice. It's sort of what kind of professional do you want to be? What kind of profession do you want organizational psychology to be? And can we move a bit closer to doing it? I think we can. I think it's quite difficult, but it's not difficult because evidence-based practice itself is hard to understand. I go back to the restaurant example. If you get the restaurant example, you get what evidence-based practice is, but it's difficult to do it. Not, for all kinds of reasons. Okay, so I'm not going to talk about systematic reviews, but I can send you a video about it if you like. I won't talk about it now because I don't have enough time, but I'll just finally, just say, evidence-based practice is about making better informed decisions. Nobody really disagrees with it, but it seems there's lots of barriers to do, things that get in the way. Organizational psychology, and it would seem you already agreed right from the beginning, is not particularly evidence-based, though it likes to think it is. It likes to think it is, maybe not you, but most practitioners I come across like to think it is. There are many things we can do to overcome barriers and start to practice in a more evidence-based way. And I think the first barrier to get over is that it is not about making perfect decisions. It's about making more informed decisions. And if we can use a bit more evidence, think about its quality, understand the problem better, understand the solution, then we're doing a bit more to get evidence-based. It's not about perfection. Thank you. I'm going to stop there.
Thank you so much, Professor Rob, for your fantastic presentation. I would just like to ask you a question, a very, very quick one, and I believe that almost all of us are curious about it. What made you start this approach, this evidence-based approach? So some decades ago, what made you, start with this approach, research these issues?
Okay, so I've actually got a fairly good answer to that. So the answer is, so I started doing, for my undergraduate dissertation, don't even remember somebody called Hans Selye, who's the father of stress. If you remember him. Yeah, so I was quite interested in stress as an undergraduate. Okay, so I started reading his stuff, other people about stress and illness in particular. And I was amazed to find out that a lot of the stuff Hans Selye said was just absolute nonsense. I mean, he just made stuff up. And the kinds of claims that were made around the sort of 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and some of the 90s around stress and health were completely exaggerated. But nonetheless, he was held up as this kind of great figure. I did an undergraduate dissertation about it and being really kind of like, how come Hans Selye is in every psychology textbook? How come the general adaptation syndrome is in every single psychology textbook, but it doesn't seem to be any support for it? I was amazed at this because I believed, I had faith that if this stuff was being published and everyone's talking about it, it must be there. So I wanted to do another thing about stress and illness, specifically look at like a semi-systematic literature review again, discovering that a lot of the stuff said about it wasn't true. Then in my PhD, I started to talk about stress at work and about stress interventions. And again, at that time, lots of people were saying, oh, we know how to intervene. We can reduce stress at work. Stress at work is a terrible problem. And I was going, is it? I'm not saying it isn't, but where's the evidence for this? And at that time, I had a colleague who was a clinical psychologist. As a clinical psychologist, she had the first book about evidence-based medicine. We often used to discuss these interventions. And she said, well, surely you should be interested in evidence-based practice. I said, gosh, what is it? And she told me, and I was, and it was there. I thought, yeah, this seems to me a way of thinking. Because it's not just about the scientific evidence, it's about other forms of evidence as well. And that to me is the most important thing. It's bringing these different things together.
Thank you.
A bit long.
No. Interestingly, I also start with stress, occupational stress. And that's what led me to a systematic review in Cochrane about occupational stress, which shows that there is little evidence, that we need more studies. So we are almost in the same boat.
Yeah, and I think it's okay to discover there isn't much evidence or it's not very good quality. But what I find very difficult is when academics and practitioners and other people are making these huge claims, whatever it is, grit, power posing, you know, it's like, come on. There may be something in this, but can we just sort of be, you know, make a claim that's reasonable given the evidence? You know, I think that's a difficulty. And again, I think academics do this a lot as well. It's not just gurus or practice. Academics do it a lot. They make these very big claims about stuff. And if you look behind it, it seems to be very often it's not really justified.
Absolutely. So thank you very much, Professor. Once again, we really enjoyed a lot. And
thank you.
I will then share the link of the presentation also with you, of course. And if you don't mind to share the slides, I will share with all the attendees here.
I will. I'll send you a link to the slides. And please, if anyone has any questions, I know I've talked a lot. I didn't give you much opportunity to ask questions. If you've got any questions, thoughts, or comments, criticisms, I'd be very happy to hear them. So please let me know if you do. I'd be really delighted. Thank you.
So perfect. So the University of São Paulo and our Laboratory of Organizational and Work Psychology is very grateful. So we see our students, we see next week in 7 days. So have a nice evening, and we see each other on the social networks and in the Google Scholar.
Thanks, George. Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Cheers.
Thank you.